Science is such a human construct. It comes from our hearts and our brains and our experiences. And I wanted to tell the whole story of where it came from, not just be like a blurb in the midst of a sea of other findings.
I'm Michael Tamblyn, CEO of Rakuten Kobo. We make e-readers and apps, we sell ebooks and audiobooks all over the world, and we do it because we love reading and we want to make reading lives better. One of the best parts of the work that we do is that we get to talk with authors about their books, as well as the books that shaped them as writers and as readers. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest today is Suzanne Simard, professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia and author of Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. It's an astonishing and inspiring book about Dr. Simard's research into the hidden relationships that tie forest ecosystems together. She explains the crucial role of vast underground fungal networks, how trees are able to learn and adapt, and how special mother trees go about ensuring the well-being of the forest community. Suzanne Simard, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you for having me.
There are a lot of different ways we can start this story, but one version begins with your father, uncle's grandfather, an outhouse, and your dog. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, we had this dog. Actually, it was a dog that was shared among all the cousins and uncles and kids and grandparents. His name was Jigs. He was a beagle, and Jigs the beagle was always getting into trouble. And so on this particular day, we were in houseboats, actually, at Cottonwood Bay on Maple Lake.
And Maple Lake is where, for those of us who aren't intimate with Canadian geography?
Maple Lake is in sort of south central British Columbia. It's in the Monashee Mountains. Mm-hmm. Just sort of, yeah, it's getting, British Columbia has got like many mountain ranges. They kind of run north-south. And it's just as you get out of the Okanagan Valley and the mountains start to rise again over into the Monashees and Selkirks. And so it's just at the beginning of that. And so as the mountains rise up, the air rises and it rains a lot. So they're actually, we call them inland rainforests. So they're lush, beautiful forests with cedar and hemlock and white pine and Douglas fir. So just beautiful. Anyway, on this particular day, we were all parked in our houseboat. Well, we were in a logger's houseboat, my family, and I was about 6, I think. And my uncle Wilfred was parked next door in his houseboat. And keeping in mind, these were handmade houseboats. They were on wooden logs, and they were built by hand by my uncles and grandparents, and they housed loggers for the most part.
So when you say logger's houseboat, you mean houseboat built by loggers, out of logs for loggers?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. They lived on these houseboats when they were logging them out, doing the selective logging with their horses in the mountains. And so we were parked this August day on Cottonwood Bay, and all of a sudden we heard this barking. And we were on we were probably, I think we were on the wharf, and it was really this plaintive, ow, 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 ow. And so everybody, you go, oh my God, what's happened to Jigs this time? And so we all run up to the outhouse and fling open the door, and all the flies came flying out, and looked down, and there was Jigs way down at the bottom. So yeah. So we had to, my dad and uncles, and my dad was really had a weak stomach. And so he always would gag at at those smells. But my uncles and my grandpa, they just got down to business, and they dug Jigs out.
And so as the digging was taking place, what did you see?
Well, for one, it's the colors, right? The colors in the soil and the roots and the fungi. But these soils in particular, now, as I went on through my career, I realized how special these soils were, because they were in the inland rainforest where there's a lot of rain. And that means that a lot of water percolates through those soils. And as they do that, they create these horizons. And they're all, basically they start out with like the really thick forest floor, which is like the litter that's come down from the birches and the cedars and the hemlocks. So really thick, rich forest floor with all kinds of insects and bugs crawling through it, and thick with roots, because the roots were, a lot of them are at the surface because they're trying to get nutrients there. I mean, I didn't know that at the time, but I remember my, the digging and the pickaxes and trying to get through these roots, and then getting into this really, white layer, and then this bright red layer. And that is such a signature of these particular kinds of soils in this kind of environment, where the water percolates through the forest floor, washes sort of organic matter out of this white horizon, which is really drenched soil, and drenched of all of its color. And then that color, the iron, the humus, gets deposited in this second layer, or this deeper layer, which is bright red as a heart. And I was fascinated by that red, and then it fades to yellow. And so you can imagine it's like a Picasso painting. It was so beautiful. And so I became fascinated with all those colors. And of course, the French swearing and the yelping of the dog and the excitement. It was very exciting.
You grew up around loggers, foresters. That was the family business going back generations. What was it like to grow up as a kid around that?
Well, I didn't really know what that meant, right?
Sure.
It was all I knew. So I mean, it was exciting, like my grandfather built all of his own boats, all of his own wharves. He built a pile driver. He would build, he built his own tugboat. And I remember, them pushing, these big wharves for the summer logging with the horses right on the wharves, because they had to transport the horses across the lake to where they would log. And so all of that was super exciting. And then, the flumes that my grandfather and his brothers, they built them all by hand. And so we just played and hiked and looked at all this stuff all the time. My grandfather had this huge workshop that he, of course, built himself, and every tool he pretty much built himself. And he was such a tinkerer. And I remember, being in his workshop and just like, oh my God, this is so fascinating. So yeah, it was pretty cool.
And as we'll see later on, as we keep talking, these two things kind of come together in your later research life. Being close to the forest, being kind of right up close and personal with trees, but also the constant kind of tinkering and experimentation and putting things together to try and figure out what's going on behind the scenes. Yeah. You don't aim for a slow reveal in this book. You say it right up front. Trees are talking to each other right in the introduction, and that there is a network that's pervasive through the entire forest floor. Young and old trees are communicating with each other. Old trees are nurturing young ones. They can describe threats. They pass on solutions. It sounds almost magical, which I guess is true of the very best science. We've long believed, thanks to Darwin, that all life is operating in a state of competition for resources and for the survival of offspring. What was the first experience that you had that suggested that perhaps this wasn't the case?
Yeah, that's a great question. So of course, I grew up in this entangled place, right, where all these trees grew all over top of each other. Their roots are all entwined. Their crowns are meshed together. There's all this huge structure in the forest. And keeping in mind, these trees are huge, right? Like they're like 40 meters tall. And so this is what I knew. And then when I became a forester, which, by the way, I didn't know what a forester was until I went into it. Even though I grew up around all these foresters, it was like, what's a forester? But anyway,
well, and take a second, describe what is a forester compared to the other careers that tend to be adjacent to forests.
Yeah, so a forester is someone, a professional who is trained to in all stages of forest development and how humans manage and use those forests, mostly for timber extraction. Forestry has traditionally been focused on timber extraction. Now it's now I'm a professor at UBC, and our faculty of forestry is at least half of the people are conservationists. So protecting the forest and looking after species at risk and looking after the hydrology and trying to understand soil. So it's very diverse. But when I was a student, it was much narrower and more focused on timber extraction. When I was an undergraduate student in the late 70s, early 80s. And so when I started there, so focused on logging and bridge building and road building, and silviculture was actually quite new at that time. Silviculture is the art and practice of growing trees. So after the harvesting, then there's the sort of like the type of forester who's on the extraction side, and then there's a second type of forester who comes in and then replants the forest and reforests. And so that was relatively new when I started. And also letting girls into the faculty was brand new as well. So these things came together. And so as I came to university not knowing what I wanted to be. I thought maybe I would want to go into medicine or writing, or I didn't know. I didn't know what a forester was, although I grew up around loggers, and even there was a forester in the family, David Simard. But most of them were just learned it by the seat of their pants. So that it was a profession was brand new and astonishing to me. And then when I went into it and started learning about forestry, it was industrial forestry. And when I say that, I mean, at that time, they were moving into this big industrial model of clear cutting and planting following clear cutting. And the plantations that were being developed were like completely different than these cathedrals that I'd grown up in, right? We were converting these, astonishingly diverse forests that were so lush and vital and productive into these plantations. And then part of that process of planting and then looking after those trees involved getting rid of the native plants. And so this became a big concern for me because I grew up around these native plants, right? The thimbleberries and raspberries and lilies, and they were, I was learning that these were evil plants, right? That they compete with these conifers, and that we therefore have to get rid of them. And so of course, I'm like swept along in this, and as I'm going along, going, why are we getting rid of these plants? Why are we spraying these plants? And so then I embarked on this research program. Luckily, I all the things aligned, and my job was to figure that out, right? Was how are they interacting with conifers? And as I learned, I realized I was studying it and realizing that, yeah, they're a little bit competitive, but for the most part, they just collaborate together, that they're all in this ecosystem and they're interacting with each other in intimate ways and helping each other survive in this diverse ecosystem. Now we know diversity is directly correlated with productivity. And here we were trying to get rid of that diversity. And so I knew in my heart that it was wrong because that's not how I saw forests, but I also was able to study it and measure it and find out that, yeah, indeed, it is wrong to do that.
You started to build a hypothesis around the cooperation between fungi and trees. And this was something that you encountered in the middle of a clear cut in one of your first jobs.
When I started out, I was like 20 years old, right? And I'm working for this forest company, and it was very basic forestry. And I was, I was given a number of jobs, but one of them was to do silviculture, and I was just a field technician, and I was, I had to go into these plantations. Well, first of all, I was involved with helping plant them, and then I would go back and assess how they were doing, and realizing that and they were, at the time I was working in these high elevation forests in British Columbia, meaning that they were up the mountains. It was spruce and subalpine fir, and right below that is the alpine. So very steep mountainous valleys. And after they would cut these high elevation forests and replant them, the seedlings were not doing well. And so I was tasked with, my job was to go back and evaluate them, and realizing, what are we doing wrong here? And realizing that, the roots were not taking hold in the soil. And why was that? They were just not connecting with the soil. And so I started to put together this idea, and digging around and trying to understand these dead roots and these dying seedlings, and and how they compared with the natural seedlings, and realizing that we had completely missed the point here. We were planting these little plugs in the soil, and they stayed that way. It's like putting a carrot in the ground, whereas the naturally regenerating seedlings had roots that went everywhere, right? And they were colorful and linking in with the soil. And I'm going, yeah, that's what we need to emulate. So that got me started on this journey.
And you found out along the way that there was some traditional knowledge around this as well, that the West Coast Salish people thought the same thing about roots and trees and fungi as well.
Yeah, and I'm not an Aboriginal person myself, but I've been very fortunate that at UBC I have a research associate, Dr. Teresa Ryan, who is Tsimshian Nation, which is a mid-coast British Columbia nation. And she brought to my attention, after I'd done like a ton of research already on networks and fungi and how the forest was all connected together. We started working together in about 2014, and she said, that we've always known about these. And she brought to my attention writings of Bruce Miller, Subier, from the Coast Salish in Seattle area. He was from the Snohomish First Nation, or the Snohomish tribe along the coast, and they're clearly written, that underground was this vast network of fungi that that connected to these seedlings and helped them survive, and that that the soil is this big connected place, and that this was all reflected in they understood this as knowing that we were all connected, right? We are all one together, and that is like the worldview of the nations across North America and around the world, is that we're all connected to the earth and we're all one together. And of course, right, it made sense. And I was, I felt so happy that I was able to see this, right, and use my clumsy Western scientific instruments to actually see these ancient connections that was in ancient knowledge systems already. And the funny thing is that now because I've published it in scientific journals and it's becoming more known, now people are going, oh, that's really cool. Like the rest of the world is getting on board and going, oh yeah. And the common response is, I always knew this in my heart, that it was connected and communicating. I could feel it in the forest. And it's true, like we are from the trees, right? We are evolved from the eukaryotic cells and the prokaryotic cells that moved out of the ocean onto the land, and we're all one of this in the same and together. And so this is in our DNA, it's in our bones. And so, and Western science is given the license for us to believe it. Whereas, I think in our Aboriginal people, those ideas or that knowledge was considered, mystical and was largely ignored. And so I'm really happy that, that my work is able to provide a window into those ancient and extremely valuable and extremely sophisticated knowledge systems.
Something that this book illuminates so well is how discovery and research can be both fast and slow. That there are moments of insight and then years of research. And there are some moments in the book that I both loved and kind of found a little bit daunting, that could be summarized as, and then the experiment didn't work for the next 3 years. where you are, you know where you need to get to. You've set up a set of experiments to try and figure it out, and then and then not this way and not this way and not this way, and now we've got it going. Can you talk about what propels you forward when it's, year 2 of 3 and all the trees died again and you have to go and replant them and, and try a different way?
Yeah, I know, that dogged perseverance. Well, when you're when you're working in natural systems like forests, things take, you said, you hit it right on. They take a long, 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 long time. And I actually have started an experiment called the Mother Tree Project, which is a 100-year experiment. So obviously, I'm not going to see it until I'm not going to be around for the whole thing. But it's okay, right? Like it's so interesting figuring this stuff out. And so, like, how do you have patience for decades, and how do you have patience trying things over and over again? Well, I'm driven by wanting to protect forests, right? And to ensure, try to help do my part in fostering their resilience. And I've always been driven by this desire to help the forest or be part of it. And then, of course, I had children later on, and that drove me even more to make sure, or to try and do my part to create a better world for my kids, or to at least be part of the solution. So yeah, that is so important. Just those inner drivers. I think that it's so important. It's so important to me. Every day I go to the forest, and every day I thank those trees for being part of me, or for letting me be part of them. Even though forest research takes forever, there's all kinds of little steps that don't take very long, right? You can do these little experiments that you go, aha, that's how that little thing works, because there's also a lot of things that happen very quickly in forests. So if you drill down into like the fungi and the bacteria and the centipedes in the soil, they're all moving around really fast. And you can study those and see the immediate effect on the plants and the trees. And in a forest, as a forest develops, some of the most important things that happen are at the beginning. So when there's a disturbance like a fire or a clear cut or a blowdown, the seeds get established, and that's like such an important thing, right? The seeds germinate, they tap into the network, and they start to establish. And then how they establish right away determines the trajectory so much of the rest of the life of that forest. It's like if you get your kid on a good start, and they learn to read, and they learn to count, and and they have good parenting, the rest of their life should be pretty good. And it's the same thing in forests. What you do early on, or how those plants get established, how the seedlings get established, sets the trajectory, and for the most part. And so it's really thrilling to be part of that early stage and then see how it plays out.
If we look at the trajectory of your research from those first inklings that you had about how trees and fungi might be connected, how trees might be connected to each other, what would you consider to be the moments when big pieces of the puzzle fell into place for you between then and now?
That's a really great question, and that kind of harkens back to your comment that you can get these big explosions of discovery, and then like all the filling in of the gaps as for years. It can take years to do that. And so the milestones for me, when I started my PhD research, was the discovery that plants are moving things back and forth. That was huge. Prior to that, of course, there was my work just figuring out that these native plants were so important to the health of the trees. That was a huge milestone. And so then after the discovery that that birch and fir were trading carbon back and forth, and that got published in Nature, and I got lots of criticism at that point. There was lots of questioning by the academics. There was like pushback from the forest industry and government. And I was having kids at the time. And through all of that, even though I was completely devoted to forests, I almost threw in the towel on looking at plant communication because it was really difficult.
And no one wanted it to be true. Like if you were in forest management, it created complications. If you were in government, it caused policy complications. There were lots and lots of people who had lots of reasons to hope that maybe you would go away and stop talking about this.
Exactly. They wanted me to shut up, Simard. But you're absolutely right. Industry didn't want to know about it because they wanted to keep going on, clear cutting and planting their plantations. Government wanted things to be easy to measure and easy to look after. Like if we just get rid of the competition, everything will be fine. So they developed policies on that. And then academia was really upset because this seemed to, they interpreted my work as saying competition didn't matter. And that's never what I said. I always said that some multi-dimensional interaction between these plants. But you know how people are, they get in camps, right? Oh, you said this and it must be wrong. And it's like, the truth is always like more nuanced and complex than that. And so, yeah, so the ecologists, the academics didn't want it because it seemed to fly in the face of Darwin, which is never really the point. I was always, interested in ecology. And so was Darwin, by the way. He was a good ecologist and an evolutionary biologist. And he understood the importance of collaboration as well, but it never, got the traction that his work on competition and natural selection got. And it wasn't until Lynn Margulis really, developed the endosymbiotic theory, and we realized that collaboration is an essential part of evolution. But that didn't really get widely accepted, I think, until the Human Genome Project, when we started going, oh, our DNA is full of virus DNA and prokaryotic DNA, and we were actually like these bags of consortiums of other creatures, and so now I think it is more widely accepted. Yeah, so there was a lot of pushback, and then so I thought I'm going to ditch this, and I didn't, because I left the Ministry of Forests and went into academia. And the academia, to get grants, you really need to build on your areas of success and expertise. And so I thought, well, I'm going to go back to this. I'm going to start building my grant program and my research program on this. But I was really still frustrated because the science was still hung back by visualizing what these networks look like in the forest and proving that they existed. And it's like every study had to keep proving the same thing over and over again. And I'm like, oh, this is exhausting, right? And then in about the late 2000s, a number of researchers from China published a suite of papers on networks in agricultural crops, and realizing that there were defense signals moving through networks between tomato plants. And it was like they completely blew past, what the Westerners were struggling over was the existence of these networks. And they were saying, what does it mean for ecology and evolution? And I'm like, thank God, and it's like suddenly the whole field blew open. And at the same time, I had a student, Kevin Byler, where we were mapping what the network looked like in the forest. And that was also a second very important point, because once that map came out, it was like people could relax and say, okay, now we can see what it looks like. And so then, since then, there's been lots of important steps, but then I would say the next important step was we did experiments with the same group in China who were working with agriculture crops, and brought that science to forests, and realized that defense signaling and other kind of information was moving through networks. I actually worked with Yan Song, who was the lead researcher on the tomato plant work. And together we found out that defense signaling happens in forests in a big way, and it affects the upcoming, the next generations of plants, their ability to fend off beetles and budworms and pathogens. We started understanding that trees could recognize their own kin. So the area of kin recognition really blew open, and into conifer forests. And I was working with the lead researcher, Susan Dudley, on that. And so these to me are huge milestones.
Tell me about some of that information that's passing back and forth between trees. Are there big families of communication? How would you categorize it?
Yeah, well, I think like three major areas. So the one area that I really focused on at first was resources. So that move through networks. So resources are things like nutrients, carbon, water, things that plants need to grow. The basic building blocks of proteins and cellulose and and proteins and so on. And then I've moved on, and now we know that like this other information is moving through. So if a plant is injured or a tree is injured, it will send messages to its neighbors telling them that I'm injured, and you need to pay attention. And so what we've able to see is that those neighboring plants then upregulate their RNA, and they start making or synthesizing defense proteins and enzymes, and they actually increase their own defense against that herbivore or pathogen that's infected the primary plant. So what the properties of those defense compounds moving, or we think they're the defense compounds themselves moving through the network, we don't know exactly, but it's linked, as far as we can tell, to this other pathway in the initially injured plant, which is called the jasmonate pathway. And the jasmonate pathway is really, it's been well studied by biochemists, and we know that, individual plants, that pathway is triggered, and a whole bunch of intermediary chemicals are produced that end up, affecting the root system. And we think that some of those constitutive elements and chemicals are what actually move through the network. We've done some primary work on like the basic building blocks of those chemicals, but we really don't know what they are. The third area is these kin recognition elements. What are the chemicals that allow plants to recognize their own kin? We don't really know. We know carbon is involved, but that's about it. At the same time, there's other researchers looking at how plants communicate through the air, and they also are focused on chemistry. Other people are looking at sound as a way for plants to communicate and perceive things, and there's been progress there as well. But what this is getting at is that plants are sophisticated. They have many ways to communicate with each other. And my question would be, why wouldn't they? They're sitting in one spot, trees for thousands of years, trying to communicate with their neighbors that are also there for thousands of years. They would develop, a suite of ways to do that, just like when we communicate, have a suite of ways to communicate with each other.
One thing that I found most fascinating about that was the extent to which it can cross species. I think we're all used to communicating amongst ourselves as individual species, and we imagine that dolphins and monkeys and all kinds of other animals can communicate amongst themselves. But you see Douglas firs communicating with ponderosa pines. You see different kinds of trees collaborating with each other across species barriers, and that was really interesting to me.
I think the logical place to have started would have been within a species. And, so Douglas fir was one place where I did a lot of work in these, because they do grow in sort of relatively pure stands. But the most part of our forests here in Western Canada are mixed forests. And I think I would argue around the whole world that, trees and plants grow in communities of many species interacting together. And it is that diversity that provides them with the health and the productivity, because they can access different niches in the soil, in their crowns. They can actually have synergistic effects where their interaction makes them even more productive. And so, starting with a single species makes sense, because, it makes sense from an evolutionary point of view that these phenomena would be going on within species. But why between species? Well, I think it is because, that diversity, from that diversity emerges health and productivity and resilience. So it makes total sense to me.
Where do mother trees sit in the middle of all of this, literally?
Yeah, so mother trees are really just the biggest and oldest trees in forests. Or even if your forest is one age, they would be just the biggest trees. And the reason is they have great big root systems. So just like they have big crowns above in the overstory, they also have big crowns below ground. And so they have many, many roots with many points of contact. And so all of those root tips are colonized by mycorrhizal fungi. And those are the beneficial fungi that I've studied, where the tree provides photosynthate for the fungus. The fungus then uses that energy to grow through the soil and bring back nutrients and water to the tree. So it's a mutualistic trade. And so these big old trees have many points of colonization, and then the network grows out from there and connects with the other plants. And so they're just the most highly connected purely from a physical point of view, because they have these huge crowns, they photosynthesize a ton. They're the big, even from an energetic point of view, they're the linchpins in the forest. And they shovel a lot of carbon below ground. About half ends up in the soil and the roots. And so when you have a huge energy base like that in your crown feeding the root system, you could also support many, many different kinds of fungi. So there are thousands and thousands of species of mycorrhizal fungi. They all have different niches. Some are only associated with big old trees. And those tend to be big fleshy fungi that form big pipelines to other trees. And the reason that the big trees can support them is because they provide a lot of energy to them, and then they do their job of shoveling things to the next trees or mining the soil for nitrogen or phosphorus, whereas the younger trees can't support those big old growth fungi. So there's multiple reasons: the high connections, the diversity of fungi that they support, and then we've also done work showing how the seeds from these big old trees, when they germinate, they are actually favored because they're kin of these old trees. And so there's also this nurturing role of the mother trees.
It helps to have powerful parents.
It sure does. Yeah.
You describe yourself as a forest detective. Are you still in there digging around, as much as you have been before?
Oh, I just love it. Yes, I am. I have this big project called the Mother Tree Project that I started about 5 years ago, the 100-year project that I mentioned. And it's taken all this time to get it set up. And I have many, many graduate and undergraduate students working on it. I'm the leader of the project, and my favorite place is to be out there with my students, setting it up, measuring, digging in the soil, planting the trees. I mean, that's what I love. And of course, this project, we're making important discoveries, and the students, the undergrads and the grads, we're all publishing the work. So it's very exciting for all of us to be part of this.
What are you hoping to discover over the course of 100 years?
Well, one of the things about the basic research I've done on plant communication and kin recognition is, okay, so that's really cool. Those phenomena are cool. For the most part, I would say the industry and governments have ignored those ideas. They still are doing their usual thing of, clear cutting, planting, and weeding out the plantations. So I thought, I've got to demonstrate how this works. How do we actually apply this in forestry? And so the Mother Tree Project is about that, is how do you save mother trees, like as singles or groups or big groups, or do you thin them out? And then how do you also change the forest slowly so that they're adaptable as climate changes? So planting within those forests migrated genotypes from warmer climates to cooler climates to try to get an understanding of, what will that forest look like and how can we help it along as climate changes? We have 24 forests across a 900-kilometer climate gradient in Douglas fir forest, and so it's huge. We're finding out important stuff already. So one of those things is that when we keep mother trees, major things happen. One is that they provide seed, and we're finding like natural regeneration is booming under these old trees. The second thing is we're finding is that when we plant these warmer genotypes underneath the old mother trees, they also are protected. So the survival rates are way higher when they're associated with a partial canopy cover of mother trees. And then I would say, other points, the diversity of understory plants is way higher because they like that cool, fresh, moist understory, protection from the old trees. And then the carbon. The carbon is such an important part. If you clear cut, you lose right off the bat about 60% of the carbon from those forests, just from the chainsaw effect, just from cutting down the trees, turning them into pulp or whatever you turn them into. And then there's a disturbance to the forest floor and we lose some of that carbon, we lose the understory. And so it takes decades, we found from our modeling, decades to recover that. And so what this points to is that if you leave some of these old mother trees, you don't lose nearly as much carbon, and the sites recover almost like within a very short period of time. From a climate change perspective, this is enormously important because we, as you know, as we have all heard in the news many, many times, we only have we don't have much time to change the course. And this is one way we can do that in forestry, because forestry, the clear cutting on top of the wildfires that are taking off, on top of the beetle kill, on top of oil and gas and urban development, is causing our forests to become a net source of CO2 to the atmosphere, whereas they've always been a sink. But if we leave some of these old trees, we're finding they can continue to be sinks.
You are a field researcher. You are dragging tanks and tents and gear through through the wilderness, and then working with undergrad and grad students back at University of British Columbia. What triggered the impulse to turn this into a book of popular nonfiction that everybody could read?
So of course I've published all my work, all these findings in journals, and they can sit there in peer reviewed journals, and if you're lucky, they get attention from the criticisms, or maybe you'll get a popular science writer write about it. But for the most part, science ends up being unused or not used enough. We know so much more than we actually apply. So there was that. I was frustrated that my work wasn't being taken up and applied. The other motivating thing is that lots of other people were starting to write about my work. And so it's ended up in different books and even movies. And I thought, that's only part of the story, right? That it's very much just focused on these are the results of the science. And I wanted to reach out and say, this is a process. It's very much it's so human, right? Science is such a human construct. It comes from our hearts and our brains and our experiences. And I wanted to tell the whole story of where it came from, not just be like a blurb in the midst of a sea of other findings, but this is a story, right? So anyway, I really wanted to convey that. And of course, I always loved to write. And I was kind of frustrated with science writing. You're only allowed so much latitude, and I wanted to express myself in a more creative way.
Were there any other books that you looked to as you were trying to decide how to tell this story that you wanted to tell?
There's lots of them, but one of them is The Golden Spruce by John Vaillant. That's a very dramatic,
such
great storytelling and dramatic, and it really, you're captivated by it. And I thought, I loved that book. I thought it really, did a great job of conveying, the danger of the business and, just what it was like. And then Grant Hadwin, I love the adventure of, Grant Hadwin cutting down the golden spruce. And so I love I love adventure. And then I also was reading Nancy Turner's Earth's Blanket, she is an ethnobotanist. She was a professor at University of Victoria, and she's written extensively on ethnobotany of plants, but also what it means to the First Nations of British Columbia. And the Earth's Blanket is really about those plants and the different nations and how they use them and what it meant to them, their philosophy, their worldview. Another important book recently was Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, she is Potawatomi, and she's written beautifully about how she relates with plants and how her nation related with plants. And so that really, I was inspired by those.
There is so much of you and your life in this book. As you say, it's not just the science, it's not just the research, it is your journey to become a researcher, your journey through the research, while also different struggles within your careers, becoming a mother, surviving cancer. Were there points where you were trying to figure out, should I put this in? Should I not? Were there things that you struggled with in terms of how much to put into the story?
For sure. Of course. Yeah. And of course, I learned about story writing and how you know, you to build tension and to resolve. And so, yeah, and so building those tension points, and what would they be? I actually I have an agent, and he helped me, and I had a writing coach who helped me figure out, what were those main points, and some of them I wasn't sure about, like, and I like I remember talking with my family and friends, and they're saying, well, don't put the cancer part in because we don't want you to be defined by your cancer experience. And so I thought, okay, maybe, but it was such an important turning point for me. Then my relationship with Mary, and then my kids, like, how much of my kids do I reveal in this book? Anyway, yes, it wasn't clear. It wasn't always clear, and I definitely had internal conflict about what to include.
I understand that not only have you written the book, but you are also the voice of the audiobook version as well. Can you tell me a little bit about that process?
I was actually not going to do it at first, and then the senior editor at Knopf, Vicki Wilson, convinced me I should do it, and so here I am. I'm actually in Vancouver, especially to do this. I came here because there's a good recording studio, and there's a director, and there's a sound engineer, and I sit in this room with my headphones on, with a microphone, and read read the book, and I read a sentence, and it's like, stop, you forgot that word, you mispronounced this, and so and you're going way too fast, but now I've got, it didn't take long, and they whipped me in shape, and so now it's going actually pretty well. The part that I find the hardest, I think, is like the emotional part, is trying to read about my brother's death and the emotion around that, and not being an actor, but trying not to get too wrapped up in my own emotions, but also conveying emotion, as an actor, kind of. I don't know, that's been challenging, but for the most part, I'm so glad I'm doing it. I'm getting such an appreciation for audiobooks.
And honestly, that was a dimension that had never occurred to me, which was, yes, of course, you have to read it well, but this is also your own life. So these are things that you're then reliving as you're reading, and you have to gauge how much to let that through.
Yeah. Like yesterday I read the chapter where my brother died, and I said to the director, I says, I don't know if I can, how do I read this? How do I read this sentence, the moment he died? And she just let me figure it out on my own. She didn't really say anything. And so then I figured out how to do it. And yeah, it was really emotional for me to do that. And I'm glad that those chapters are done. So I can go on.
And now back to the science.
One of the things that I wondered too, as I was reading, I thought, is this really boring, right? Like, describing the experiments, like, I was thinking, I don't know if I could, last through trying to understand these experiments, but yeah. So I was wondering, I guess the question for you is, how did you find reading about the, setting up the experiments and then the execution of them? And
something that I think happens so well within the book is that you're constructing a series of building blocks about both the chemistry and the biology that's going on within a forest. And so by the time we are, tenting trees and injecting them with different kinds of carbon, we're like, okay, yeah, no, this is the next step in the in what we need to do. Let's go. Like, I cannot wait to find out.
That's really interesting.
And by that time, we're right there. And at the same time, seeing the linkages between that work, or dragging tanks of nitrogen around, and your grandfather's workshop filled with gadgets and tools that he'd invented himself. So I think it all came together like a dream. Suzanne Simard, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for those great questions.
I've been speaking with Dr. Suzanne Simard, author of Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. Find it and the other books we've talked about, along with previous episodes of the show, at kobo.com/conversation, or check the show notes for a link. Make sure to catch every conversation by subscribing wherever you listen and leave us a review, because it helps other readers find us. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamlin. Thank you for listening.